One of my coworkers who I've known for a very long time asked me to look at their chainsaw. I don't recall if they told me what the problem was other than it needed new fuel lines, which they provided. As much as I wanted to believe him, I'm pretty sure that if it was stored with fuel in the tank or hadn't been used in a very long time, more than likely it's going to have more than just one thing wrong with it. What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this Poulan Pro chainsaw, and the problem is that apparently it just needs fuel lines because it's leaking fuel everywhere. However, since this saw has been in storage for some time, we're also going to inspect the carb to make sure it's in working condition. Now, I'm going to try and repair this chainsaw, however, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. Now, I wasn't able to get a lot of information about this chainsaw when I picked it up from my coworker, so I'm going to look it over and see what kind of condition it's in. I'll be looking for anything obviously wrong with it, and from what I can tell by the lack of wear on the logo on the bar, it hasn't been used very much. So unless they ran it on straight gasoline, it should be in decent condition, aside from some wood pulp here and there. The first thing I want to check is the fuel in the tank and see if there's still some in there. And it looks like it's empty, which is a good sign. Now the fuel filter isn't in there, and that's because someone already put it in the bag of new items to be installed on this chainsaw. Now the fuel cap retainer, which keeps it from being lost, has come off and is resting inside the tank, so we'll have to fix that as well. Now, I don't normally check the bar oil tank, and I've been called out on it before, so I'll check to make sure there's still some in there, which there is. That means if we get this saw running, the chain will have some lubrication, just so long as the oil pump is working, of course. The next thing I want to do is to slowly pull on the rope and gauge if there's enough compression from the engine. Now the engine is fighting back a bit, but it's not as much as I would like it to be. Either it was ran with a fuel mixture that didn't have enough oil in it, or there might be an issue with the piston rings. I do feel as though there's more than enough compression from the engine to run, so I won't bother doing compression tests at the moment. Now to confirm this, I want to try and start the engine by manually priming it with some fuel. I'll start by taking off the top cover, removing the air filter, and then putting some fuel into the carb's throat. Then I'll try and start it, and hopefully it runs for a few seconds. So luckily it started and ran for a second, although it didn't run as well as I wanted it to. But the fact that it did start and run means we have a working ignition system and enough compression from the engine. If yours didn't start and run, you should check that you have a working ignition system by using a spark checker, and that there's enough compression from the engine by using a compression tester. Links for both of these items are in the description if you want to know more about them. To replace the fuel lines, we'll need to remove the carb, and since it'll be off the engine, it'd be a good idea to take it apart and inspect it. Now with the carb still in place, I want to see how the fuel lines are ran. Having looked into the fuel tank, this line is the fuel filter line, and it's supposed to go to the right side of the carb. As you can see, the line is off of the carb, and that's because it's breaking down. The larger fuel line is the return line, and it starts at this opening under the carb and travels under it and connects to the primer bulb. The other shorter line goes to the primer bulb and connects to the left side of the carb. What I just described is not how the fuel travels through the line, it's just a description of how the lines appear to be ran, so that's how I'm going to replace them. Before we can remove the carb, I'm going to take off the blue choke lever and the only fuel line that's still connected. Once those have been taken off, carefully pull the carb away from the engine. The only thing that's keeping this carb from smoothly coming off is a rubber boot on the intake that seals to the upper air inlet on the carb assembly. Now that the carb is off the engine, I'm going to start removing all the fuel lines from this area, followed by anything left in the tank. Since we already took note of where all the lines are supposed to go, I'm going to remove all the lines at once, but if you want to remove one line at a time and then replace it before moving on to the next one, I won't blame you because that's what I used to do as well. Now, with the carb out of the way, I'm going to recap how the fuel lines will be ran again. This smaller opening to the tank will be the fuel filter line, and it will go to the right side port on the carb. This larger opening to the tank will be the return line, and it will connect to the longer port on the back of the purge bulb. That leaves the shorter port on the bulb, and it will connect to the port on the left side of the carb. So here's the bag of goodies that came with this chainsaw. There's some yellow fuel line, some clear line, a new purge bulb, and some gaskets. I already took out the fuel filter from the bag because it's going to need some attention. Now to start off, I'm going to remove the purge bulb, and to do that, we need to carefully squeeze the tabs on the back of it and gently push. Unfortunately, I forgot that I needed to remove the recoil assembly because it's going to keep it from releasing from its opening. I also noticed that some of the screws are missing, which means someone started to do this repair and stopped. Now with the recoil assembly gone and with the tabs already squeezed on the purge bulb, it should easily come out. So here's the old one next to the new one, and I hate to say it, but the original color for this bulb is a light red, which means the old one wasn't as old as I thought it was, but since I've got it out, I might as well replace it anyway. Now, to reconnect the retainer to the fuel cap, just place the metal ring with the tabs in the middle of the cap and press the tabs firmly into place. You don't have to press hard, but you do have to work your way around the ring. Once that's done, try pulling on the retainer to make sure it's not going to come out again. So the old fuel filter is covered in old 2-cycle oil. To clean it, I'm going to put it into a cap filled with carb cleaner, then I'll spray some more of it through an old fuel line to try to get rid of the oil. After that, I'll blow some air through the line, mainly because I don't want to waste more of the cleaner than I have to. So here's the filter after it's cleaning. It's not perfect, but I got rid of the majority of the oil. Although I don't think it would have really hurt anything, I didn't want to have to worry about it. The next thing I want to do is to start running the fuel lines using the supplied lines. The first line I'll be running is the larger fuel line, which is sized at 3/16 of an inch, and this is going to go to the larger opening. This, of course, will be our return line back to the fuel tank. After cutting the line at an angle and pushing it into the opening, this is what it should look like inside the tank. After that, I'll use some bent pliers to carefully work the line into the tank. Once we have enough line, I'll pull the line out of the tank, cut the angle piece off, and install the plastic splice that I found in the tank. Then pull the extra line out of the tank till it stops. This plastic splice is to keep the line from coming out of the tank. This is what it should look like once we've finished installing the return line. If for some reason you don't have a plastic splice to install, leave at least 1 inch of line inside the tank. After that, I'll then run the extra line towards the area where the purge bulb sits. I can then run the fuel filter line using the same method, except this time I'll be using the smaller fuel line from the supplied parts kit. This line is sized at 140 thousandths of an inch, and instead of installing a plastic splice, we'll be installing the fuel filter. Now, to make installing the fuel line a little bit easier, you can put some sort of lubricant on it. It's okay if you don't want to, but you could break the fuel line, which did happen to me. If you need some fuel lines, filters, or purge bulbs, there should be a link in the description. Now, when you put your filter back in the tank, make sure there's enough fuel line in the tank so the filter can reach the far side of the tank. This is important because if you're low on fuel and you have the bar parallel to the ground, you run the risk of starving the carb and the engine of fuel. At this point, I'm ready to cut the fuel lines to length. Now, after cutting the return line near the purge bulb, I'll then connect it to the longer port on the purge bulb. I'll then cut a shorter piece that will go to the short port on the bulb and then connect it to the left side port on the carb, but I won't do that until I've inspected the carb. So this carb is a little bit different because it has a second air inlet with its own butterfly. Now, to inspect the carb, we'll need to remove this part of the assembly. The next part I want to remove is the metal plate that covers the metering diaphragm. I want to inspect its condition to make sure it's still flexible so it can control the fuel flow through the carb. So unfortunately, it does look like it's hardened up a bit, which is not what we want. To confirm, I need to carefully remove it from the gasket for a better inspection. And as you can hear, it's making a popping noise, which it's not supposed to do. That means we'll need to replace it. After removing the single bolt that secures the pumping section to the carb, we can see the pumping diaphragm and the inlet screen. Luckily, it's clear of any dirt or debris, so we'll move on to inspecting the pumping diaphragm. We want to make sure that the 2 check valve flaps are parallel with the rest of the diaphragm and that they are not bent towards the pumping section. The easiest way to tell is to look at it from the side. After looking at it for a bit, it looks like the flaps are indeed parallel with the rest of the diaphragm, so I'm going to reuse it. If yours are not parallel and bent, the easiest thing to do is to replace the carb. The reason is finding the right rebuild kit can sometimes be a real hassle. The next thing I want to do is to check the fuel flow through the inlet screen. For this test, I'm going to fill the screen pocket with fuel and then press the rocker arm on the other side of the carb. We should see the fuel disappear from the pocket as it passes through the screen so it can be delivered to the engine. And as you just saw, the fuel very quickly disappeared from the screen, which means we shouldn't have any issues with this carb. If your fuel does not disappear, then you might have to remove the needle and rocker arm assembly to safely clean the screen, or it might be easier just to replace the carb. This is the metering diaphragm I'm going to be using. The one issue is that it doesn't look exactly like the original, but the most important part is the stem in the middle. Now the stems can either be long or short, and this one happens to be the shorter one. When installing the diaphragm, remember to install the gasket first, followed by the diaphragm, and then the metal plate. Now, once the metering side is done, I can now replace the pumping side. I didn't show me spraying this thing down with carb cleaner, and the reason is that I didn't find any old oil residue or any substantial dirt that might cause any real issues. However, if you find yours clogged with oil or debris, then you might want to spray the internal passages with carb cleaner and maybe some low pressure air. With the carb assembly back together, I can now install it into the chainsaw. I'm going to start by connecting the short fuel line from the purge bulb to the port on the left side of the carb, which is also the side with the two black fuel adjustment screws. Then I'll connect the smaller fuel line to the port on the right side of the carb, which has all the levers. Once the lines have been connected, I'll then carefully install it back onto the engine studs. Next, I'll then carefully install the blue choke lever to the left side of the carb, then swing the air filter base back towards it. However, before you do anything else, connect the throttle cable to the lever on the right side. Then you can slide the base onto the studs. While holding it against the engine, I'm going to work the trigger to make sure it's working the throttle like it should, and it looks like it's working just fine, so I'll finish the installation. I know we're not done putting this saw back together, but I want to put fuel into the tank so I can test the fuel system. If we find a problem now, it'll be much easier to fix now than later on. So when pressing the purge bulb, fuel should come up from this line into the right side port on the carb, make its way through the carb, then out of the left side port, through the short fuel line and into the short port on the bulb. It should then partially fill the bulb and finally out the long port and back to the tank. So we finally have some fuel coming in from the short fuel line. It's taking its time filling the bulb, but once it does, it's leaving through the longer port and heading back to the fuel tank. That means our fuel is flowing through the lines just like they're supposed to, which means we can finish putting this chainsaw back together. If you don't see any fuel getting to the primer bulb or it's flowing the wrong direction, I would suggest that you check that the fuel lines are connected correctly. You might also have a problem with your carb. Now that it's finally back together, we can try and start it. Also, make sure you follow the instructions that are posted, and if it doesn't start, don't be surprised if we have to make a few adjustments to get it to work correctly. So it does start and run, which is great. However, after letting it idle for several seconds while partially choked, it stalls after a few seconds with no choke. What I'm going to do is turn the L screw, which controls fuel flow at idle speeds and when you're squeezing the trigger, counterclockwise a quarter turn to allow more fuel to the engine. I'm also going to turn the idle adjustment screw clockwise a bit to increase the idle speed. Unfortunately, that didn't work, but I feel the extra fuel is helping because it idled a bit longer before stalling, so I'm going to turn the L screw counterclockwise another quarter turn and see if that improves anything. So yet again, it still wants to stall after squeezing the throttle to get it out of choke. I guess I could have let it idle with the chain brake on, but it's 60 degrees outside, so it should be able to idle with no choke, especially after the third time it started. Now by this time, the engine would be warmer than the air temperature. I'm going to save you the trouble, but I did try and take some fuel away from the setting we started with, and it didn't help. In fact, it didn't even try to start. Now at this point, I'm beginning to get a bit concerned with the engine and the compression. I noticed that it felt a little worn out when pulling on the rope, so I want to use my tester to see if it's on the border of working. However, this is when I started to have some issues. Whoever installed this plug the last time was apparently very upset because I'm having problems breaking it loose. After finally getting it loose, I also want to inspect the spark plug. Well, it turns out there's a lot of carbon on it. Instead of replacing it, I'm going to clean it, but only after I do the compression test. Now, the tester will measure how much pressure the engine can make on the compression stroke, and the higher the better. So after several pulls, the reading is only 100 psi, which isn't all that great because I was expecting a much higher reading, something around 130. However, this is good news because if the reading was around 60 psi, which is not the reading you want to see, it might explain why it's not running correctly. As it stands, it shouldn't have any problems running as far as the engine is concerned. I do want to see how well the spark plug is working before I clean it, so I'm going to use my spark plug tester. So it seems to work surprisingly well considering how much carbon is on it. The only ways that I could think of on how this spark plug got covered in carbon is that it must have spent most of its running time idling and never being used to cut wood. The issue is that that doesn't make any sense. The other option would be that there was too much oil in the fuel mixture. Now, according to the owner's manual, the correct fuel mixture for this chainsaw is 40:1, or basically 3.2 ounces of oil to a gallon of gasoline. If there's too much oil in the mixture, the extra oil could build up as carbon on the spark plug and in the exhaust port. If that happens, some of the carbon could break off and damage the engine, which would explain why the compression is lower than it's supposed to be. Now, it's not brand new, but I was able to get a lot of the carbon off of it, so it should work a lot better. I'll put it back in the tester and see if there's any difference. I know it was hard to tell, I probably should have shot it in slow motion, but what I saw was there were more times I saw multiple sparks on the electrode on the clean plug versus the dirty one. I don't know if it'll make any difference, but I want to put it back in the engine, start it up, and see if it'll stay running. When I was putting the plug back into the engine, I finally noticed what happened to the spark plug tool. I don't know what it was torqued to, but it was way more than it was supposed to be. I want to bend it back straight, but I kind of like it like this. I didn't film it, but I did turn the L screw back to the normal setting before we started making changes. So it didn't stall this time after turning off the choke, and it seems to be running really well. The best part about this chainsaw is that it still runs great and cuts really well too, even after sitting in storage for a very long time. Like I mentioned earlier, I put the L screw back to where I found it before I started turning it, which is where the factory had it set at. So another option as to why this chainsaw wouldn't stay running at idle with the choke off even after adjusting the carb is that there's a problem with the carb. The solution is to clean the carb in an ultrasonic cleaner or just buy a new carb. Just as a reminder, always remove the fuel from the chainsaw after using it and then turn it back on to run the fuel out of the fuel system. This will help to ensure that it will start back up the next time you need to use it. So my question is, if your chainsaw won't stay running or even start, would you go straight to replacing the dirty spark plug? Personally, I never get that lucky, and it typically turns out to be a bigger problem like this one, but it looks like cleaning the plug worked just as well as replacing it. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.